The year is 1943, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt sits across from Joseph Stalin at the Tehran Conference. Roosevelt, the pragmatic American president confined to a wheelchair by polio, finds himself face to face with a man whose regime has already claimed millions of lives. Stalin appears unremarkable at first glance, standing just 5'4" tall, his face marked by smallpox scars from childhood, his left arm slightly withered from a boyhood injury. He is in his mid-60s now, his trademark mustache thick and dark, his eyes calculating behind the genial facade he presents to his wartime allies. What Roosevelt cannot fully comprehend in this moment, what the American intelligence services are only beginning to piece together, is the staggering scale of death that Stalin has orchestrated within his own borders, even as Soviet soldiers die by the millions fighting Nazi Germany. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Between the time Stalin consolidated power in the late 1920s and the end of World War II, somewhere between 15 and 20 million Soviet citizens died as a direct result of his policies, and this does not even include the Soviet soldiers killed fighting the Germans. These were not casualties of war with a foreign enemy. These were Soviet citizens, people who lived under Stalin's rule, who were deliberately starved, worked to death in labor camps, executed after show trials, or simply shot without trial at all. Stalin engineered famines, signed execution lists over dinner, and created a system of terror so pervasive that people disappeared in the middle of the night, and their own families would never speak their names again for fear of being next. To understand how one man could orchestrate such catastrophic loss of life requires going back to the beginning, to the murky origins of a boy named Iosif Vissarionis Juashvili, born in 1878 in the small Georgian town of Gori in the Russian Empire. His father was a cobbler and a drunk who beat both the boy and his mother. His mother, Ketavan, was devoutly religious and desperately wanted her son to become a priest. She managed to get him enrolled in an Orthodox theological seminary in Tiflis, now known as Tbilisi. But the young Stalin, who would later adopt that name meaning man of steel, found something else in that seminary besides religion. He found revolutionary literature, forbidden books about Marx and Lenin, about overthrowing the established order and creating a workers' paradise. He was expelled from the seminary in 1899, and from that point forward, his life became one of revolutionary activity. He joined the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the group led by Vladimir Lenin that would eventually seize power in Russia. Stalin's role in these early years was not that of a theorist or intellectual. He was an organizer, a man who got things done through any means necessary. He organized bank robberies to fund the party, an activity that brought in desperately needed cash, but also revealed something essential about his character. He was willing to do whatever it took, to cross any line, to achieve the goal. Violence was not something that troubled him. It was simply a tool. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, Stalin was there, not at the forefront, but in the middle ranks, competent and ruthless. Lenin appointed him to various positions, including Commissar of Nationalities, dealing with the ethnic minorities that made up so much of the former Russian Empire. During the brutal civil war that followed the revolution, a war that killed millions and devastated the country, Stalin showed his capacity for absolute ruthlessness. In the city of Tsaritsyn, later renamed Stalingrad in his honor, he ordered mass executions of suspected enemies without trial, without evidence, without mercy. Lenin died in 1924, and what followed was a power struggle that Stalin won through a combination of bureaucratic maneuvering and outright elimination of rivals. Leon Trotsky, the brilliant military organizer of the Red Army and many people's favorite to succeed Lenin, found himself outmaneuvered by Stalin's control of the party apparatus. Stalin formed alliances with various party factions, then turned on them once they had served their purpose. By 1928, he had consolidated enough power to launch the policies that would define his rule and cost millions of lives. The first great catastrophe was collectivization. Stalin decided that Soviet agriculture needed to be completely transformed. The country had millions of small peasant farmers who owned their own land or worked land communally in traditional village arrangements. Stalin declared this backward and inefficient. He wanted large collective farms that could be controlled by the state, that could produce grain for export to fund rapid industrialization, that could be monitored and managed from Moscow. The peasants who had a bit more than others, who were called kulaks, were declared class enemies. They were to be liquidated as a class, a bureaucratic phrase that meant destruction. Starting in 1929 and accelerating through the early 1930s, millions of peasants were forced off their land. Their property was seized, their animals slaughtered or taken by the state. Those identified as kulaks, a category that expanded to include anyone who resisted collectivization, were shot, sent to labor camps in Siberia, or deported to inhospitable regions where they died of exposure and starvation. Entire villages were emptied. Families were torn apart. Children were separated from parents. The scale of the operation was staggering, and it was carried out with systematic brutality by party officials, secret police and activist brigades sent from the cities. The result was predictable to anyone with basic understanding of agriculture, but Stalin and his officials either did not care or refused to see it. Agricultural production collapsed. Peasants who had been forced onto collective farms had no incentive to work and no knowledge of how to operate in this new system. They slaughtered their animals. Rather than turn them over to the collectives, they hid grain or refused to plant. The state responded with even harsher measures, confiscating seed grain meant for planting, taking food from villages at gunpoint, setting impossibly high quotas that could never be met. The result was famine, but not just any famine. This was a man-made catastrophe, a deliberately engineered humanitarian disaster. The worst of it hit Ukraine in 1932 and 1933, an event now known as the Holodomor. Soviet officials sealed off Ukrainian villages, preventing starving peasants from traveling to cities to find food. They set up roadblocks and checkpoints. They confiscated every scrap of food they could find. People ate grass, bark, anything they could find. They ate their pets, then horses, then things that cannot be mentioned. Reports from the time, from foreign journalists who managed to get in, and from Soviet officials' own internal documents, describe scenes from hell. Bodies lying in the streets, families dying in their homes, children with swollen bellies and stick-thin limbs. The death toll from the Soviet famine of 1932 to 1933 alone is estimated at somewhere between 3 and 7 million people, with Ukraine bearing the worst of it. Some historians argue the numbers could be even higher. Stalin knew what was happening. He received reports. He saw the statistics. He did nothing to alleviate it. In fact, evidence suggests he deliberately intensified it in Ukraine as punishment for Ukrainian nationalism and resistance to Soviet rule. While millions starved, the Soviet Union continued to export grain abroad. Stalin needed the foreign currency to buy industrial equipment from the West. The lives of peasants meant nothing compared to his grand vision of transforming the Soviet Union into an industrial power. But collectivization and famine were only the beginning. By the mid-1930s, Stalin had become increasingly paranoid. He saw enemies everywhere, conspiracies in every corner. The Communist Party itself, the instrument of his power, became suspect. Old Bolsheviks, who had made the revolution with Lenin, military officers who had won the Civil War, intellectuals and artists, economic managers and factory directors, even loyal party members who had never shown a hint of disloyalty, all became potential targets. In 1934, Sergei Kirov, a popular party leader in Leningrad, was assassinated. The evidence strongly suggests that Stalin ordered the killing, though this has never been definitively proven. What is certain is that Stalin used Kirov's death as the justification for what became known as the Great Terror, or the Great Purge. Starting in 1936 and continuing through 1938, Stalin launched a campaign of repression that was staggering even by Soviet standards. The mechanism was simple and terrible. People were arrested by the NKVD, the secret police. They were accused of being enemies of the people, spies, saboteurs, members of imaginary conspiracies. They were tortured until they confessed, and the confessions were used to implicate others. Each arrest led to more arrests, each confession to more confessions, in an ever-expanding spiral of accusation and denunciation. The NKVD had quotas to fill. certain numbers of enemies to be found in each region. Local officials competed to show their loyalty by uncovering more conspiracies, arresting more wreckers and traitors. The show trials were the most visible part of this terror. Old Bolsheviks, men who had spent their lives building the Soviet state, were paraded before courts and forced to confess to absurd charges. They admitted to being spies for Germany, for Japan, for Britain, for anyone and everyone. They confessed to plots to assassinate Stalin, to sabotage the economy, to restore capitalism. The confessions were obtained through torture, through threats to family members, through psychological pressure, through promises that confession would save their lives. It saved no one. After the public humiliation of the trial, they were taken away and shot. But the show trials were only the tip of the iceberg. For every prominent party member tried in public, there were thousands upon thousands of ordinary Soviet citizens arrested and executed in secret. Engineers were accused of sabotage when machinery broke down. Doctors were accused of deliberately harming patients. Teachers were accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda. Workers who showed up late to their factory jobs could be accused of sabotage. Peasants who failed to meet grain quotas could be accused of wrecking. The accusations did not need to make sense. The evidence did not need to exist. The process was the punishment, and the punishment was almost always the same: death or the Gulag. The Gulag system, the network of labor camps that sprawled across the Soviet Union, particularly in the frozen wastes of Siberia and the far north, became a machine for destroying human beings. Prisoners were worked to death in conditions of unimaginable brutality. They mined gold in temperatures that dropped to 50 below zero. They cut timber in forests where wolves and bears roamed. They built railroads and canals and roads, and their bodies were left where they fell. The camps were deliberately designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum sustenance. Death rates in some camps exceeded 50%. Prisoners arrived, and within months or a year or two, they were dead from starvation, disease, exposure, or simple exhaustion. The Great Terror consumed the Communist Party itself. Of the 1966 delegates to the Party Congress in 1934, over half, 1,108 people, were arrested, and most of them executed. Of the 139 members and candidates elected to the Central Committee at that same Congress, 98 were shot. The military was devastated. Stalin executed 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, 13 of 15 army commanders, 57 of 85 corps commanders, and 110 of 195 division commanders. He wiped out the leadership of the Red Army on the eve of the greatest war in human history. Why did he do this? The motivations are complex and perhaps ultimately unknowable, locked inside the mind of a paranoid dictator. But certain patterns emerge. Stalin wanted absolute power, and that meant eliminating anyone who might conceivably challenge him. He wanted a party and a society completely subordinate to his will, where people were too terrified to think their own thoughts, much less speak them. He believed, or claimed to believe, that as the Soviet Union grew stronger, its enemies would become more desperate and resort to more subversive tactics. Therefore, the stronger the Soviet Union became, the more vigilant it needed to be against internal enemies. This perverse logic justified unlimited terror. The numbers from the Great Terror are disputed, but even conservative estimates are horrifying. At minimum, 680,000 people were executed in 1937 and 1938 alone, shot after quick trials or no trials at all. The total number arrested was somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million people. Many of those not executed died in the camps. The terror destroyed families, atomized society, and created a culture of denunciation where no one could trust anyone, where children informed on parents and colleagues, informed on each other. By 1939, Stalin had created a state drenched in blood, a system where terror was not an aberration, but the normal functioning of government. And then he made a decision that shocked the world. In August 1939, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who negotiated it. The public part of the pact promised that the two countries would not attack each other. The secret protocol, not revealed until after the war, divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be split between them. The Baltic states would go to the Soviet Union. Stalin and Hitler, the communist dictator and the fascist dictator, would cooperate. The pact made cynical strategic sense from Stalin's perspective. He had spent years warning about the threat of fascism, but he had also watched Britain and France try to appease Hitler, giving him Austria and Czechoslovakia in hopes of avoiding war. Stalin decided that the capitalist democracies were trying to turn Hitler east to set Germany and the Soviet Union against each other while they watched from the sidelines. Better to make a deal with Hitler, Stalin calculated, to buy time to prepare for the war that Stalin must have known was eventually coming. Better to divide Poland with Germany than to see Germany occupy all of Poland and have Nazi troops right on the Soviet border. When Germany invaded Poland from the west on September 1st, 1939, starting World War II, the Soviet Union invaded from the east on September 17th. They met in the middle and divided the country. The Soviets then proceeded to occupy the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, forcing them to accept Soviet bases, and then annexing them outright in 1940. They attacked Finland in the Winter War, expecting an easy victory, and instead getting a bloody nose from determined Finnish resistance before Finland finally ceded territory in March 1940. Everywhere the Soviets went, the NKVD followed, and the terror began again. Polish officers, intellectuals, and political leaders were arrested. In the Katyn Forest and other locations, the NKVD executed roughly 22,000 Polish officers and elites in the back of the head and burying them in mass graves. Stalin personally signed the order for these executions. Throughout 1940 and into 1941, Stalin received warnings that Hitler was preparing to attack the Soviet Union. Soviet spies sent reports. British intelligence, despite the fact that Britain was at war with Germany and the Soviets had effectively been helping Germany by providing oil and raw materials, tried to warn Stalin. Even German soldiers and officers who opposed the Nazi regime tried to get word to the Soviets. Stalin dismissed all of it. He convinced himself that Hitler would not attack until after defeating Britain, that the warnings were British provocations trying to drag the Soviet Union into the war. He ignored his own intelligence services. He refused to believe what he did not want to believe. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. 3 million German and Axis troops, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft smashed into the Soviet Union along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It was the largest military operation in history, and the Soviets were caught almost completely unprepared. Stalin had refused to allow defensive preparations because he thought they might provoke Hitler. He had decimated the Red Army's officer corps in the purges. Soviet forces were poorly positioned, poorly equipped, and poorly led. The result was catastrophic. In the first weeks, entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. The Germans advanced with shocking speed. They took Minsk, capital of Belarus, in less than a week. They drove deep into Ukraine. They besieged Leningrad. The Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse, and for the first few days after the invasion, Stalin appears to have had something like a nervous breakdown. He retreated to his dacha outside Moscow and did not issue orders. Other Soviet leaders had to come and essentially beg him to return and take charge. But Stalin did return, and what followed was 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. The war on the Eastern Front was fundamentally different from the war in Western Europe. This was total war, war of annihilation, war where entire populations were targets. Hitler's plan for the Soviet Union was explicit. The Nazis intended to destroy the Soviet state, enslave or exterminate the Slavic population, colonize the territory with German settlers, and exploit the resources. The Wehrmacht was ordered to treat Soviet civilians as less than human. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were deliberately starved to death or worked to death. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the German army and systematically murdered Jews, communists, intellectuals, and anyone else deemed undesirable. The Nazi occupation was genocidal, and it radicalized the war into a fight for survival. Stalin's response combined genuine strategic skill with utter disregard for human life. He was capable of making the hard decisions necessary to save the Soviet state. When German forces approached Moscow in October and November 1941, Stalin remained in the city, a powerful symbolic gesture that stiffened Soviet resistance. He oversaw the evacuation of Soviet industry eastward, moving entire factories from Ukraine and European Russia to the Urals and Siberia, beyond the reach of German forces. This was a massive logistical achievement that preserved Soviet industrial capacity and allowed continued production of tanks, planes, and weapons. Stalin also made crucial decisions to bring in competent military commanders. He was forced to release some officers from the Gulag and reinstate others he had disgraced. Georgy Zhukov, who would become the most important Soviet military commander of the war, was given increasing responsibility despite having been in disfavor before the war. Stalin learned, slowly and at terrible cost, to listen to his military professionals rather than dictating every operational decision himself. Though he never fully relinquished control and his interference often led to disasters. But Stalin's methods of motivating the Soviet population and the Red Army were characteristically brutal. Order number 227, issued in July 1942, was titled, "Not One Step Back." It established penal battalions for soldiers accused of cowardice and blocking detachments that would shoot their own retreating troops. Soviet soldiers were given a choice between possible death advancing toward the Germans and certain death retreating from German gunfire into Soviet machine guns. The order created a culture where Soviet commanders would spend lives without hesitation because they knew their own lives depended on showing aggression and achieving results. The Soviet Union's scorched earth policy added to the civilians' suffering. As Soviet forces retreated in 1941 and 1942, they destroyed everything that might be useful to the Germans, burning crops, blowing up factories, evacuating livestock. This was militarily sound, depriving the Germans of resources, but it left the Soviet civilian population that fell under German occupation with nothing. People caught between the retreating Soviets and the advancing Germans faced starvation even before the Germans implemented their own policies of deliberate starvation. The siege of Leningrad stands as one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes of the war. German and Finnish forces surrounded the city in September 1941, cutting it off from supply except for a precarious route across Lake Ladoga. The siege lasted 872 days, until January 1944. During that time, somewhere between 800,000 and 1.5 million civilians died, mostly from starvation. People ate wallpaper paste, petroleum jelly, anything with calories. They burned furniture for heat during winters when temperatures dropped far below freezing. Bodies piled up in the streets because people were too weak to bury them and the ground was frozen solid. Stalin could have attempted to evacuate more civilians before the siege ring closed. He could have prioritized civilian supplies over military supplies in what did get through. He did neither. The city had to hold for symbolic reasons. Leningrad was the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, and the people trapped inside were expected to endure anything to deny it to the Germans. When Zhukov was asked by Nikita Khrushchev about the fate of Leningrad's people, he reportedly said that sacrifices were necessary and that the city would hold. The suffering of civilians was acceptable collateral damage. The Battle of Stalingrad, from August 1942 to February 1943, became the symbol of Soviet resistance and the turning point of the war. The fighting was incredibly brutal, house to house, room to room, sometimes both sides, holding different floors of the same ruined building. The casualty figures are staggering. The Red Army suffered over 1 million casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. German and Axis forces lost between 750,000 and 900,000 men. The civilian population, caught in the fighting, was devastated. Exact numbers are unknown, but tens of thousands of civilians died. Stalin's role in Stalingrad showed both his strengths and weaknesses as a war leader. He understood the symbolic importance of the city that bore his name and refused to let it fall. He eventually approved the counteroffensive Operation Uranus that encircled the German Sixth Army. A brilliant strategic stroke, but he also interfered in ways that increased casualties, insisting on premature offensives and refusing to allow retreats that might have saved lives. Soviet soldiers were sent into battle with the expectation that casualties did not matter, that men could be spent like ammunition as long as the objective was achieved. This attitude toward casualties persisted throughout the war. Soviet offensives were often marked by massive frontal assaults with minimal tactical sophistication. Artillery would blast German positions, then waves of infantry would advance, often with inadequate support. When those waves were cut down by German machine guns and artillery, more waves would follow. Soviet commanders were under intense pressure to achieve results quickly, to meet timetables set by Stalin and the High Command, and the easiest way to do that was to throw more men at the problem. The Red Army did develop more sophisticated operational art as the war went on, using deep operations and coordinated armor and infantry assaults to achieve breakthroughs, but the fundamentals often remained the same. Take the objective whatever the cost. The scale of Soviet casualties in World War II is almost impossible to comprehend. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people during the war. Of these, somewhere between 8 and 11 million were military personnel killed in action or died of wounds, disease, or as prisoners. The rest, roughly 16 to 19 million, were civilians. These civilians died in the fighting, from German atrocities and deliberate starvation policies, in the siege of Leningrad, from disease and privation caused by the war, and yes, from Stalin's own policies. Because here is the terrible truth: Stalin did not stop being Stalin just because the Soviet Union was fighting for survival. The NKVD continued to operate throughout the war. Political officers watched for signs of disloyalty. Soldiers who were captured by the Germans and then liberated or escaped were treated as traitors, interrogated by the NKVD, and often sent to the Gulag. Stalin could not conceive that anyone captured by the enemy might be anything other than a coward or a traitor. His own son, Yakov Dugashvili, was captured by the Germans in 1941. The Germans offered to exchange him. Stalin refused, saying he would not trade a lieutenant for a field marshal, though this is likely apocryphal. Yakov died in German captivity in 1943. Entire ethnic groups were accused of collective treason and deported en masse. The Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, and others were rounded up and forcibly transported to Central Asia and Siberia in conditions of horrific cruelty. People were given hours to pack, loaded into cattle cars, and shipped across thousands of miles. Many died in transit. Those who survived found themselves dumped in inhospitable regions with no preparation, no infrastructure, nothing. They were left to starve or survive as best they could. The deportations killed hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed entire cultures. Stalin also used the war to expand Soviet territory and influence. As the Red Army pushed the Germans back and advanced into Eastern Europe, Stalin made clear that he intended to dominate the region after the war. The Polish resistance, which had fought the Germans throughout the occupation, found itself betrayed. In August 1944, as Soviet forces approached Warsaw, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising, expecting Soviet support. Instead, Stalin halted the Red Army outside the city and watched while the Germans crushed the uprising, killing 200,000 Poles and destroying Warsaw. Only after the Germans had finished did the Soviets move in. Stalin wanted a Poland he could control, and the Polish Home Army, which was loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, was an obstacle. Throughout Eastern Europe, as the Red Army arrived, the NKVD followed. Communist parties that had survived in underground during the Nazi occupation were given Soviet backing to seize power. Non-communist resistance groups were disarmed and their leaders arrested. Elections were rigged. Opposition politicians were intimidated, arrested, or killed. Stalin was creating a buffer zone, a cordon of satellite states between the Soviet Union and the West, but he was doing it through the same methods of terror that he had used at home. Now we return to Franklin Roosevelt, sitting across from Stalin at Tehran in 1945. Roosevelt needed Stalin. The Soviet Union was doing the bulk of the fighting against Germany. Soviet casualties dwarfed American and British casualties. The Red Army was grinding down the Wehrmacht, destroying division after division in brutal attritional warfare. D-Day would not happen until June 1944, and even after that, the majority of German forces remained on the Eastern Front. Roosevelt and Churchill both knew that Soviet contribution was essential to defeating Hitler. But what did Roosevelt know about the price the Soviet population was paying? What did he know about Stalin's pre-war purges, about the Ukrainian famine, about the Gulag? The answer is complicated. American intelligence services had information about Soviet atrocities. Reports from journalists, from diplomats, from defectors, painted a picture of a brutal dictatorship. Robert Conquest's later historical work would document the Great Terror in detail, but even during the war, information was available. Malcolm Muggeridge had reported on the Ukrainian famine in the 1930s. Accounts of the purges had reached the West. The Nazi-Soviet pact and the Soviet invasion of Poland had shocked Western observers. But Roosevelt was a practical politician facing an existential threat. Nazi Germany had to be defeated, and that required working with Stalin. Roosevelt appears to have believed or hoped that he could moderate Stalin through personal diplomacy, that by building a relationship of trust he could steer Stalin toward cooperation in the post-war world. At Yalta, Roosevelt was a dying man, exhausted by years of war leadership and ravaged by cardiovascular disease. He would be dead within 2 months. He made concessions to Stalin, accepting Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe, accepting Stalin's promise to hold free elections in Poland while knowing or suspecting that Stalin had no intention of allowing genuine democracy. Churchill was more skeptical of Stalin. But Churchill too needed the Soviets and could not afford to break with them while the war continued. The Western Allies made a calculated decision to focus on defeating Hitler and worry about Stalin later. In the context of 1943 or 1944, with Nazi Germany occupying most of Europe and threatening Britain with V-2 rockets, while murdering Jews in industrial gas chambers, this was arguably the right calculation. But it meant allying with one monster to defeat another, and the people of Eastern Europe would pay the price for the next half-century. The American public's view of Stalin during the war was heavily shaped by propaganda. The Soviet Union was presented as a heroic ally, bravely resisting Nazi aggression. Stalin was Uncle Joe, a grandfatherly figure leading his people in a righteous struggle. Hollywood made movies depicting noble Soviet resistance. Journalists wrote admiring accounts of Soviet fortitude. The terror, the purges, the Gulag, all of it was downplayed or ignored in the interest of maintaining the alliance. Critical voices were dismissed as anti-Soviet propaganda or isolationist, fifth columnists trying to undermine the war effort. This was understandable in the context of wartime unity, but it was also a massive disservice to the truth and to the memory of Stalin's victims. The people who starved in Ukraine, who were shocked in the cellars of Lubyanka prison, who died in the Gulag camps, who were deported in cattle cars, their suffering was erased from the narrative to maintain the fiction of noble Soviet resistance, and Stalin himself was fully aware of the propaganda value of the alliance. He cynically played the role of loyal ally, making gestures like dissolving the Comintern, the International Communist Organization, to reassure his Western partners, while simultaneously preparing to dominate Eastern Europe after the war. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Stalin stood as one of the victors. The Soviet flag flew over the ruins of the Reichstag in Berlin. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe from the Baltic to the Balkans. Stalin had achieved what Russian emperors had dreamed of for centuries: domination of Eastern Europe and a glacis of buffer territory protecting Russia from invasion from the West. But the cost was apocalyptic. The Soviet Union was devastated. Cities were in ruins. Agriculture was shattered. Industry that had not been evacuated eastward was destroyed. And nearly 30 million Soviet citizens were dead. Of those 30 million, how many died because of Stalin's policies, rather than simply because of the war? This is where the accounting becomes complex and controversial. Some deaths were clearly the result of Nazi aggression. The Einsatzgruppen murdered over 1 million Jews on Soviet territory. The Wehrmacht's brutal occupation policies killed millions more civilians. The deliberate starvation of Soviet prisoners of war killed several million. These deaths can be laid at Hitler's feet, not Stalin's. Though Stalin's purge of the Red Army officer corps and his refusal to prepare for the invasion certainly made the Soviet Union more vulnerable to Nazi aggression. But other deaths were more directly Stalin's responsibility. The soldiers shot by blocking detachments or sent into hopeless attacks. The civilians left to starve in besieged cities when evacuation was possible. The prisoners of war who survived German captivity only to be sent to the Gulag. The deported ethnic groups who died in transit or in exile. The people arrested by the NKVD during the war on spurious charges of espionage or defeatism. These deaths, perhaps numbering in the hundreds of thousands or low millions during the war years themselves, were the product of Stalin's system of rule. And then there is the larger question. How many of the Soviet Union's wartime deaths were made inevitable by Stalin's pre-war policies? The Great Terror destroyed the Red Army's leadership. The collectivization and famine weakened Soviet agriculture and made it harder for the Soviet Union to feed itself during the war. The climate of fear and rigid ideology made it impossible for Soviet commanders to show initiative, for Soviet society to adapt flexibly to crisis. Stalin's paranoid refusal to believe warnings of the German attack meant the Red Army was caught unprepared. The catastrophic defeats of 1941, the millions of Soviet soldiers captured in the early months, the loss of vast territory and population. All of this can be traced back to Stalin's pre-war policies. So, in a sense, Stalin bears responsibility, not just for the deaths directly caused by his wartime policies, but for making the Soviet Union more vulnerable to Nazi invasion, and thus indirectly for many of the Soviet casualties that followed. Historians continue to debate the exact numbers. The range of estimates for total deaths attributable to Stalin's policies, from the late 1920s through his death in 1953, runs from a low of around 9 or 10 million, with many estimates clustering in the range of 15 to 20 million. These numbers include the victims of collectivization and the resulting famines, the victims of the Great Terror, deaths in the Gulag system, deaths from wartime policies like deportations and executions, and the post-war period when Stalin's repression intensified again. The exact numbers will probably never be known with certainty. The Soviet state kept records, but they were often falsified, and many records were destroyed. Mass graves continue to be discovered. Demographic analysis can provide estimates, but margins of error remain large. What is beyond dispute is that Stalin's rule was one of the bloodiest in human history. Only Mao Zedong's policies in China, which may have killed 30 to 40 million or more through famine and repression, clearly exceeded Stalin's death toll. Hitler's regime killed approximately 11 million people in the Holocaust and additional millions in the war, a monstrous evil but numerically in the same range as Stalin. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge killed perhaps 2 million people in Cambodia in 4 years, an even higher percentage of the population but smaller absolute numbers. Stalin's Soviet Union stands with these regimes as one of history's greatest man-made catastrophes, and yet Stalin died peacefully in his bed in March 1953, probably of a stroke, after ruling the Soviet Union for nearly 30 years. He was never held accountable. He was never tried for his crimes. He was mourned by millions of Soviet citizens who had been indoctrinated to see him as the great leader and father of the Soviet people. His body was placed next to Lenin's in the mausoleum on Red Square, though it was later removed during the de-Stalinization campaign under Khrushchev. Monuments to Stalin dotted the Soviet Union. Cities bore his name. His birthday was a national celebration. The full truth about Stalin's crimes only began to emerge after his death. When Khrushchev gave his secret speech in 1956, denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and some of his repressions, though even Khrushchev did not reveal the full extent of the terror. The archive slowly opened over the decades, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Historians gained access to documents that confirmed and often exceeded the worst estimates. Mass graves were excavated. Survivors of the Gulag told their stories. The true history of Stalin's rule emerged into the light. Today, the memory of Stalin remains contested, particularly in Russia itself. Some Russians remember him as the leader who defeated Hitler, who turned the Soviet Union into a superpower. who commanded respect and fear from the West. Others remember the terror, the suffering, the millions of deaths. The Russian government under Putin has been ambiguous, sometimes condemning Stalin's repressions while simultaneously rehabilitating his image as a strong leader who made Russia great. Victory in World War II, the Great Patriotic War as it is known in Russia, remains a source of national pride, and Stalin's role in that victory makes it difficult to fully confront his crimes. But the historical record is clear. Joseph Stalin was responsible for the deaths of millions of his own people. He created a system of government based on terror, where human life had no value and fear was the primary instrument of rule. He engineered famines, signed execution lists, built the Gulag system, and purged his own party and army on the eve of the greatest threat to Soviet survival. Even during World War II, even while the Soviet Union fought for its existence against Nazi Germany, Stalin continued his repression, deporting entire ethnic groups, executing suspected traitors, and treating Soviet lives as expendable resources to be spent in pursuit of victory and power. Franklin Roosevelt's shock, if he ever fully grasped the scale of Soviet suffering and Stalin's responsibility for it, would have been the shock of a decent man confronting absolute evil, wrapped in the guise of wartime alliance. Roosevelt died before he could see Stalin's post-war consolidation of power in Eastern Europe, before the Iron Curtain descended, before the Cold War began. But the seeds of all of it were visible in Stalin's wartime conduct for anyone willing to look closely. The man who could starve millions of his own people to enforce collectivization, who could execute hundreds of thousands in the Great Terror, who could deport entire ethnic groups in cattle cars, was not going to transform into a democratic statesman just because he had helped defeat Hitler. The tragedy is that it took so long for the full truth to be acknowledged, that Stalin's crimes were minimized or ignored for decades, that victims were forgotten while their murderer was celebrated. The opening of the archives, the work of historians like Robert Conquest, Anne Applebaum, Timothy Snyder, and many others, the testimony of survivors, all of this has finally created a clear picture of what Stalin's rule meant for the Soviet people. It meant suffering on a scale almost beyond human comprehension. It meant a society where everyone lived in fear, where no one was safe, where denunciation could come at any moment and condemn you and your family to death or the camps. It meant the destruction of entire communities, the erasure of cultures, the trauma that still echoes in the societies of the former Soviet Union today. Stalin's legacy is written in mass graves, in the ruins of the Gulag camps, in the demographic hole left by the millions who died, in the memories of survivors and their descendants. It is a legacy of terror and suffering that must be remembered, not to score political points or to fuel contemporary conflicts, but because those millions of victims deserve to be remembered, because their suffering was real, because the truth matters. Joseph Stalin was one of history's greatest mass murderers, and that fact cannot be erased by his role in defeating Hitler, or by nostalgia for Soviet power, or by geopolitical calculation. The dead demand that we remember them, and the historical record, now finally available, ensures that we can.